Good morning, everybody. This is part 2 of lecture 5 in the course of psycholinguistics. The topic of this part is about comprehending figurative language. In this part, we will study the following main items. We will talk about introduction to figurative language, and we will know or define what is figurative language, types of figurative language, and finally we will expose some studies on figurative language comprehension. As we have seen in the previous lectures, that humans use a set of parsing mechanism as a method to understand the exact meaning of a word or a sentence. But actually, many of the sentences or the words we use in our everyday communications or our everyday language are not meant to be taken literally. For example, we take this statement or this sentence, George went through the roof. If we take it literally, and the literal meaning is that George passed through the roof. But the metaphorical meaning is that George got angry. Let us take the second example. Birds of a feather flock together. Here, the literal meaning is that it refers to the behavior of birds, but actually the metaphorical meaning refers to the behavior of people who have the same interest or the same characteristics. If we come to the question, what is figurative language? Figurative language is a language that means one thing literally, but is taking to mean something different. It is an universal aspect of the language. This type of language is very popular in advertising and psychotherapeutic interviews, various essays and debates and other speech events in our daily life. And it is also found in our daily discourse, in our poetry, in our prayers. Recent studies shows that figurative language is no longer perceived as merely as decoration added to the everyday language, but it is instead viewed as a powerful communicative and conceptual tool. There are many types of figurative language in the literature, but we will focus only on two of them, which are related to psycholinguistics. The first is indirect speech acts, and the second is a metaphor. Now we will start with the first type of figurative language, indirect speech act. But before we know what is indirect speech act, actually we need to refer to the concept of a speech act itself. The origin of this term backs to the speech act theory, which was proposed by John Austin in 1962, where he notices some sentences are not used to describe something, but rather they are used to do something. In other words, uttering such sentences will result in the creating actions. And he called such sentences performatives and distinguished them from constitutives. Furthermore, he claims that producing any of these sentences implies three types of acts that work simultaneously when saying something. The first act, elocutionary, the second, illocutionary, and the third, perlocutionary. The first act, the elocutionary act, refers to the physical act of producing the sentence or the utterance. The physical production of the words and their meanings refers to the locutionary act. The second act, illocutionary act, refers to the act or the action being performed by producing the sentence. Any of these acts that may be performed by the speaker are called speech acts, like stating, asking, requesting, advising, warning, persuading, etc. And the third type of these acts is the perlocutionary acts, which refers to the effects that the addressee will exert after hearing such utterances. For example, the statement or the sentence, there is a draft in here. The locutionary act refers to the production of the utterance as a whole. The production of there, is, etc. All the components of the sentence or the components of the utterance. The illocutionary act refers to the act being performed by the speaker when uttering this sentence. It could be either a request, order, or whatever, depends on the situation in which the participants are in. The perlocutionary act, it could be a closing to the door or closing to the window or opposite, depends on the situation they are in. In the course of performing speech acts, we use different types of sentences. Actually, most of the world's languages have three types of sentences: declarative sentences, interrogative sentences, and imperative sentences. These types of sentences are generally matched with certain locutionary forces. The first type, declarative sentences, are generally matched or associated with asserting or stating. Interrogative sentences with asking, questioning. And imperative sentences also are associated with ordering or requesting. In the case of a direct match between the sentence type and the locutionary force, we have a direct speech act. For example, the sentence, I request you to shut the door. This sentence is imperative. The type of the sentence is imperative, but the locutionary force is request. Here we have a match between the type of the sentence and the usual locutionary force that is associated with this type of sentence. In other cases, if there is no direct relationship between a sentence type and the locutionary force, the types and the locutionary forces we have mentioned in the slides before, there is no direct relation. If there is no direct relationship between the sentence type and the locutionary force, we have indirect speech act. For example, we have the sentence. We have this sentence. It is, can you shut the door? It is interrogative. This sentence is interrogative. We usually with interrogative sentences, we have the locutionary forces asking or questioning. But here we have request. So there is no direct relationship. In this case, we have indirect speech act. Now we come to the second type of figurative language that we will discuss in this lecture, which is metaphor. According to the Dictionary of Cambridge, the term metaphor refers to an expression that describes a person or object by referring to something that is considered to have similar characteristics to that person or object. That means that we have two things to compare. These things share some features, and we try to refer to one of them by referring to the other. For example, we have here, George went through the roof. Here we compare two things, George's anger and passing the roof. Supposed to be similar, to have similar characteristics between them. The comprehension of metaphoric language poses some very interesting problems for a general theory of language comprehension in two aspects. The first aspect, metaphors are universal features of language, and thus we cannot dismiss them as a peripheral concern of language comprehension. The second aspect is the comprehension of metaphors suggests a link with the processes of language comprehension, but the manner in which words' meanings are combined to form novel metaphors are invariably false in literary terms. For this reason, we need to understand the ways we comprehend the meaning of metaphor. The meaning that is literally anomalous, but metaphorically meaningful, and not only meaningful, but even amusing and interesting. Now we come to the component of metaphor. Metaphors consist of three main parts: the tenor, the vehicle, and the ground. The tenor is the subject to which attributes are ascribed. The vehicle is the object whose attributes are borrowed, and the ground refers to the relation that connects the tenor to the vehicle. That means here we have one thing we need to compare, and the other thing we need to compare to. And there is a ground should be between them to connect the tenor with the vehicle. For example, here we have the sentence, billboard are words on landscape. The tenor here is the subject, billboard, and the vehicle is the object here, words. The grounds on which these two objects are compared is that the implied similarity between tenor and vehicle. Thus, we could say that the ground in this metaphor is that both billboards and words are ugly protrusions on some surface. What are the functions of metaphor? Basically, we have two main functions for using metaphors in language. The first, to communicate continuous experiential information, especially the information that is otherwise difficult or impossible to express in literal terms. The second function is to fill the gap that may occur between the experience and the words used to describe that experience. In our example, George went through the roof. The degree or the extent to which the degree of anger to which George has reached maybe cannot be expressed by the word anger. So that means that the word anger is not sufficient to express the degree to which George has reached. For this reason, the speaker resorts to use the metaphor to express or to fill that gap in the experience and between the experience and the words. Now we come to some studies of figurative language comprehension. We will focus on three of them: pragmatic theory, conceptual metaphor theory, and class inclusion. The first theory is the pragmatic theory. This theory assumes that linguistic communication takes place within the context of shared assumptions or conventions about communication. In other words, people follow a set of guidelines that they use or they follow when they communicate with each other in order to be understood or to express their thoughts or feelings in a clear way. Grice 1975 has identified 4 of these conventions, or what he calls maxims that govern the conversation. The first maxim of quantity, the second maxims of quality, and the third maxim of relation, and the fourth maxim of manner. Such conventions have 2 functions. The first provide a base for interpreting what others mean, and the second function is that they guide our comprehension. This theory holds that we comprehend figurative language by 2 directions or by 2 ways. The first, by considering the literal meaning, and then we reject it. Sells 1975 claims that we use several stages, of which 3 are most relevant here, relevant to the comprehension of metaphors. In the stage 1, the listener extracts the literal meaning of the sentence. In stage 2, the listener decides whether the literal meaning is what the speaker intended or not. If that's what the speaker intended, the listener will stop here. But if that's not what the speaker intended, the listener will go to stage 3, in which he will search for the indirect meaning. In the stage 3, that indirect meaning is inferred based on what? Based on communicative conventions in the situation. The second theory, which studies the metaphor, called conceptual metaphor theory. This theory argues that metaphors are not creative expressions, but rather instantiations of underlying conceptual metaphor. For example, the conceptual metaphor time is money underlies a number of verbal metaphors such as you are wasting time, how do you spend your time these days. Thus, this theory assumes that when we encounter a verbal metaphor like you are wasting money or how do you spend your time these days, whenever we encounter such a metaphor, it automatically activates the corresponding conceptual metaphor, which is time is money. The last theory that we will talk about in this concern is the class inclusion theory. This theory states that metaphors are class inclusion statements in which the tenor is assigned to a superordinate ad hoc category, whereas the vehicle is a prototypical member of that category. For instance, the sentence here we have, my job is a jail. My job is the tenor, and the jail is the vehicle, and that vehicle is supposed to be a prototypical member of a category. The term jail belongs not to one category but to several. To mention here that the category of punishments, it is a prototypical member of it. The category of buildings, it is also a prototypical member of it. And the last one is the category of unpleasant situation, which is also a prototypical member of it. In this theory, the treatment of figurative language emerges naturally from our understanding of how we access the internal lexicon. In other words, according to this theory, we understand metaphors in the same way we understand literal speech, by first retrieving lexical information from lexicon, second, selecting the part that is most relevant to the context, and then identifying the relationship between lexical representation that have been retrieved. To apply that to our example, my job is a jail. In the first place, we retrieve the lexical information about the jail and about the job, and also about the categories of the jail, how many categories the jail represent, and then we try to select the part that is most relevant to the context. Here we have many categories that the word jail represent, but we select the last one, which is the category of unpleasant situation, which is according to the context is most relevant than others. And after that, we identify the relationship between lexical representations, means between the tenor and the vehicle, that have been retrieved before. And according to this theory, we understand it in the same way we understand literal speech. That's all for today's lecture, the figurative language, that we have tackled the definition, the types, and finally we talked about some theories or studies that focus on how we comprehend figurative language. That's all. Thank you for your attention, and wish you all the best.